So I'm excited about our topic today. We're actually going to talk about the question, when do you know it's time to leave a church environment? Especially once you've seen evidence of spiritual abuse, you've seen red flags, you've seen things that seem a little toxic. How do you know when it's time to leave versus when you stay and try to make a difference? All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. And today I'm excited to be back to our roundtable conversations. We've had a lot of guests on lately, and we're going to continue having guests on. But the bread and butter, the heartbeat of Church Disrupted, has always been these roundtable conversations. So I'm excited about our topic today. We're actually going to talk about the question and answer the question, when do you know it's time to leave a church environment, especially once you've seen evidence of spiritual abuse, you've seen red flags, you've seen things that seem a little toxic. How do you know when it's time to leave versus when do you stay and try to make a difference? Okay, we get that question a ton. If you are not on the Church Disrupted community yet, on our Discord server, that is a much better place to ask those questions in social media. It's a place where those questions are rarely going to get missed. Other people are going to chime in. But that's a question that even this week I've heard from multiple people in our community. So called you guys up and said, hey, who are the right hosts for this? And I immediately thought of Leann and Corey. So today joining me, Leann Reece and Corey Laster, and we're going to answer that question, how do we know when it's time to leave a toxic or even questionable church environment? So glad that you guys are here today. When you first hear that question, what immediately comes to your mind? Because there's a lot we can talk about with that today, but what kind of comes to your mind first? Is it a memory? Is it you being in that situation? Is it a certain question, something else?
Well, for me, I think it was that question really triggers one very, very transformative thing. If you're having that thought, then bravo, that you are probably onto something that most people take too long to realize. And second, if you're realizing that, you may need to be making that a sooner rather than later decision. For me, I know that by the time I was questioning that and wondering if I was supposed to stay or should I move forward, I waited far too long to continue and try and figure out and to play the sacrificial lamb to do that for myself. I should have left long before I did. Which is a regret that I have, because what ultimately happened to me is that it was no longer a healthy place for myself. It was no longer life-giving, and my effectiveness and the ministry that I was doing was way lessened because I stuck around and continued to insist that my presence was desired and necessary in a place where God was calling me out of.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean, I don't think it means that if you are asking that question, it's immediate. You
Right.
need to leave or you should have already left. But when you get to the point of asking that question, you have hit a crossroads.
Yes.
You have hit a point where either you need to leave, you need to have already left, or something has to change. Something has to give. So I do think when you start asking that question, is it time to leave? Should I stay or should I go? Once you start asking that question, it is an indicator that, again, you've hit a fork in the road. One of three things needs to happen, but it can't stay the same anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for people to know. So as we talk about it today, our goal is not to get you to leave your church. Our goal is not to get people to throw in the towel and give up. We want you to try to make a difference for as long as possible. We want to see healthy churches. We don't want to see churches shut down. We don't want to see churches stay in their abuse. But at some point, the only vote that we have to make a change, the only action we can take is to leave.
Yes.
But beyond change, at some point, it's the healthy thing for you. And I think that's what you're getting to, Corey. So we'll come back to that here in a minute because I want to hear from Leann. But I think there's something powerful about, even for you, once you started asking that question and you were looking for reasons to stay, you weren't even at your best now, which contributes to the problem instead of making it better. But,
yes.
Anyway, man, thank you. That was a vulnerable start to this podcast. That's why I love having Corey on the podcast. Like, Corey, you are as vulnerable and transparent as about anybody that I know. And I really appreciate that, especially with all the comments I get on social media trying to clean stuff up. I appreciate the vulnerability.
I will say that one of the things a lot of people who may or may not know me personally or have heard me in this podcast before, a lot of those people will know that Jeff and a lot of my other friends, Leann included, played a super vital role in helping me to process through a lot of things I was going through personally. And it's one of the things that I really enjoy about this community is that we're seeing a lot of those questions be asked publicly, in our private community, but we're seeing a lot of people ask the questions that I was asking you guys when I was going through a lot of different stages and places in my life.
Oh yeah.
So
no, it's very familiar, which by the way, if you guys haven't joined the community, again, that's free. We don't charge for that. That is, it's provided free because it's one of the earliest things we could do when we had any donations coming in, right? And just a reminder, guys, SAI, the parent, nonprofit of Church Disrupted, we are fully nonprofit. We operate just off the generous gifts and donations of people. So, when we talk about the different projects we're doing, we got church safe assessments coming up. We're wanting to do national research on NDAs and nepotism in the church. We're wanting to start 7 table groups to help people walk through a brand new healing curriculum. But all of that, it's just dependent. Anytime you hear about those things, it's dependent on generous donors. So right now we are raising money for the fall. We've got to hit a certain amount of donations for the fall to be able to do those things. But you can join the community for free because people have donated and paid the way for you to do that. And Corey, you're in the community. Leann, you're in the community. Y'all are both kind of quiet in there. I don't think people have realized yet they can just ping you and ask a question. Right. But all of our hosts are actually in the community. You can get in touch with them directly. Also say that you don't have to just ping me. Sometimes they are a better answer to the questions than I am. But if you haven't joined the community, we'd love to see you there. Also, though, guys, if you can and you're in a place where you feel led to, we would love to have you partner with us financially because, again, we cannot do this without you. We're fully transparent on the website with how we spend the money, how we do all that. And we're really not spending any money on things other than we spend it on insurance, and we are waiting right now just to pull that money together for the fall projects, church safe assessments, table groups, all of that. So again, if you haven't gotten involved past the podcast or social media, we just want to invite you when you're ready. Feel free to do that. Join the community at no cost if you want to join as a financial partner. If you want to get involved as a volunteer, we're looking right now at how we can mobilize volunteers. The only reason we're going slow is because we don't want to burn people out like churches do. Right. So it's one of those things. I actually had someone, and we'll jump right back in, getting off topic, but had someone who said, hey, I want to help you with video editing. I do this for a living. Right. I would love to take some time off. And I said, well, my only concern is I don't want anybody volunteering more than 5 hours a week. We want to have hard boundaries so that this is life-giving to you. We're not taking advantage of you. And unfortunately, a lot of the editing projects we have take more than, they pretty much all of them take more than 5 hours. So we're trying to figure that out because we do care. So if you're interested in volunteering, let us know. But also just know we're a little slow on make any commitments to that because we want to protect people and set the example. But anyway, so great vulnerable start. We talked about the community. People know you're in there now, Corey. Leann, when you first heard that question, I texted it to you. How do we know when it's time to leave or stay? What were the first kind of things that came to your mind?
For me, it took me back to those situations when I was in that place of asking those questions. And it was a little triggering at times, think about it, because it's not just your memory that goes back there. With that comes the emotion and just, the overall feelings that you had in those moments. And for me, looking back on it, I've seen growth from it because the last time we had to make that decision, it was really easy. It was sacrificial. And to a lot of people looked really insane to do it. But it was a period of growth that it was like, I get to choose. I know what's best for me and my family. And this is the direction we're going. But it hasn't always been that easy. Yeah. There's been times where, like Corey said, it's how do I leave all the other people who haven't hurt me and that I enjoy serving with or for. Yeah. How do I leave that? Like, what's going to happen to them? But if I stay, what's going to happen to me?
And them, because they're staying with you.
Yes. And so that it's a really bittersweet thing to look back on.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the last time you got to leave before it became an incredibly abusive situation or anything like that, it was just there were some red flags, there were some boundaries that were crossed that you had said, hey, I've been through this before. Those are simply boundaries I have that are hard lines in the sand, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's an okay place to be. You can leave a church and it not be an abusive church. You can leave a church and say, hey, I think it's a good church. They just crossed some boundaries that I am not willing to cross with my family, right? So I think that's something that you can do. It doesn't mean that you're villainizing. To understand, leaving a church doesn't mean you're villainizing that church, okay? It simply means you're saying this is not the healthy place for me and my family, in this moment. And it's hard. Leaving a church, it's like leaving, friends. It's like leaving a community. It's like leaving parts of your family at times. So this is, it's super difficult. When I got asked the question, because it came like 3 times in a row from different people before I texted you guys, and I hear it a lot. I just don't hear it that often, right? That was all in one day. And when I first started hearing those questions, I saw it, my heart just broke. That's where I went back to. I went back to the heartbreak of how that feels when you first ask that question. Like, I don't want to leave. I remember feeling, I don't want to leave if there's anything else I can do to help this church and these people. I love this church. I love these people. Yes. I had given years and thousands upon thousands of hours to this church. I wanted them to do well. And that was what was so heartbreaking for me. Was I felt like if I left, I was giving up on them. I felt like if I left, I was giving up on what God could do in them and through them. Yet, because of that, I stayed too long, right? I stayed too long, and it began to do damage inside of me. And I was trying even harder to make a difference because I cared so much, when it was long past the point of anybody listening to those conversations, right? Sometimes the best way that you can get someone's attention is to say, hey, we got to leave, and here's the reason why, right? So it's kind of like, I've got 2 kids. I got 2 boys, 2 teenagers. You guys know them. When I threaten to punish them, that doesn't have the same impact as when I do it, right? So I've got one that's about to turn 16, okay? He knows that taking away his keys is going to be a part of all punishments going forward, right? That's just part of it when you turn 16. But the threat of, if you do this, I will take away your keys, never hits as hard as the moment where I say, oh, you crossed a boundary, give me your keys for 30 days. Give me your keys for a week, right? And it's the same thing with church. Sometimes it's that moment where you say, hey, peacefully, we're going to leave, but here's the reason why we're leaving. And does that need to go to everybody? Most of the time, not. Sometimes it does, depending on whether there's church discipline involved. But most of the time it doesn't. But you can go to the pastor, you can go to the elders, you can go to the staff and say, hey, here's why I'm leaving. I've known people who have written letters recently who said, here's why I'm leaving. And when you do that, you never know. That might be the moment it takes for them to make change, right? But oftentimes that's going to have more of an impact than you just begging them to make change when they know you're going to stay as well. So that's where I was at. I stayed too long trying to make that impact, when the greatest impact that I could have made probably was just saying, hey, I'm out. And in quiet conversations on the way out with HR and some certain pastors saying, hey, here's some really big issues. If you don't deal with them, they're going to shipwreck your church. Unfortunately, the church I was at, they didn't deal with those. And it's slowly shipwrecking their church, not from my vantage point. So, but I think for all of us, we felt those feelings again. We went back to that place.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that, Leann, because that's something you said that I think a lot of people in our audience, among our listeners, our community, it's really easy to miss. They think something's wrong with them because all of a sudden, something triggers. You have a reminder of a memory, and it's like you're in that place all over again. It's fight or flight all over again. It's the anger, it's the bitterness, it's the frustration, it's the heartbreak, it's the angst, it's the depression, and it can hit you in a moment, right? And that's part of the healing process. The more you heal, like you said, your credit, the less that hits you, okay? But if we don't know what it is, if we think we're abnormal, if we don't do the work of healing, that will hit you like that. You'll relive those same moments for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the rest of your life, right? So let's just talk about that in your journey healing from church hurt and spiritual abuse, right? What have you been able to do? What steps have you been able to take that have allowed those waves of grief to, 1, lessen, and 2, What have you been able to do to process those triggers so that they don't hijack you every time somebody says a certain phrase or treats you a certain way?
I'll say that there are still way more triggering things many years later than I would have ever realized. My fiance will tell me, and she'll make a comment, in conversation, and it'll have nothing to do with any type of triggering church hurt item. And there'll be some word in there that will trigger a very negative memory. And it's difficult to even consider how some of those things that should not be triggering have become triggering. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I really
now it changes your emotions in an instant. It does, just like that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm having conversations about it. So we were having a convo, and we're watching a church service online, actually, and there was a very common phrase that was used, and it was similar to a phrase that came from one of the churches where I've been a part of and left. And when that phrase hit in that service, I immediately disengaged. I couldn't look at the screen anymore. And she noticed and was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm fine." But I literally got up and went and found something else to do, and I had to take a breather. And when I came back, I was like, "Hey, listen, this is what I heard. This is what I experienced. And this is what you just watched occur." So the next time that phrase was used, because, catchphrases are really popular, and there is smooth
especially in churches. We love our catchphrases, man.
Yeah, but they slipped it in later, and it was nowhere near as triggering the second time, because I had been able to verbally place what had happened and acknowledge what had happened. It was way less triggering the second time than it was the first. So verbal discussions are one of the things I think is really important for you to be able to do. Yeah. If you can't say it and speak it and acknowledge it, I think it'll be something that will just hijack your recovery, your processing.
And it's not just the triggers. It's one of the things that I love about the community. There's a place to tell your story. You can tell it in pieces. You can tell it, anonymously. You can put your username to it. But verbalizing the truth of what happened, or the truth of what's going on. It's one of the 3 truths we talk about in table groups that you have to process to be able to heal, right? The moment that you can talk about it, it loses power.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, that's not immediate, because here's the thing. The first time you talk about your story, it doesn't come out right.
Right.
Okay. And that's why with so many people, they'll struggle in the community, because they'll say, "I'm trying to tell my story. I know it all up here. It makes perfect sense up here. And I try to tell it, and it comes out like verbal vomit, sideways. It's not in chronological order. It doesn't make sense." And that's because you're still experiencing that grief. Mm-hmm. The more you tell it, and for some people, it's helpful to write it before you tell it, but the more you tell it, the more coherent it's going to get, because, and the reason why it gets more coherent, you're not as triggered by it. When you get into that emotional fight or flight state all over again, that's why you can't share your story, because your body's being hijacked by these emotions and these triggers. You're getting what psychologists would call, you're getting flooded by emotion. It feels like all the emotion, at least for me, it feels like all the emotion's up to here, okay? And I can't breathe.
Yes.
Because I feel like I'm drowning and choking on the water of emotion. Well, the more I tell it, the more I can tell it, and then okay, well, I'm above water. This is uncomfortable. I'm above water. And then it's kind of like, eventually, you get to a point to where I tell these stories, I feel it, but it's like water around my ankles. It's a distant reminder of, oh yeah, I can still feel that. I can feel that enough to have empathy. I never want to lose that feeling completely, because then I don't empathize with people anymore. Okay. But there's something very important about being able to tell your story. And when you said your triggers out loud, this is what it was. This is why it affected me. This is how it made me feel. You actually, I don't want to explain it right now, because it will take too long. It'd be a whole podcast. Right. But you actually dipped into another one of the truths we have to process, another one of the 3 truths. So by doing that, the very next time, it wasn't as bad, and it won't be as bad. So there is power in having people to tell your story to. That doesn't have to be in our community. That can be anywhere. But when we hold it in, right, it's not going to heal. Yeah. We have to get it out. And there's something powerful about just hearing yourself say it. So, Your fiance and I, we work a side job a couple of nights a week together. Jeff, why are you working a side job? Because this nonprofit's expensive. So if you want me to stop working a side job in the middle of the night, please donate. But we were talking about, gosh, I just totally lost where I was going with that. What were we talking about?
Triggers.
Triggers.
Processing.
That's where it was. Thank you. So yeah, this is a raw and real podcast. We're very honest and vulnerable. I just triggered myself with that phrase, raw and real, by the way. So it's talking about triggers. But we're real, and I'm on little sleep this week, and I forget what I'm talking about sometimes. Don't know about you guys, but here was the confession I was going to make. I talk to myself a lot just because I've learned the power of verbal processing. So people may think I'm crazy, but I talk out loud because then I can hear it, helps me process it. So some nights I really hate the job that I'm doing. So I'm just verbally processing some stuff, and somebody will come right by me because people are passing me all night. And every time somebody comes by me, I think they're going to think I'm crazy because every time they come by, I'm talking to myself. And immediately what do I start doing? The next time I need to, I talk to myself again because it's more important that I'm processing what's going on, right? So they just think I'm mumbling to myself all the time. But there's power in talking about what happened to you. There's power in telling that truth, right? And again, that's not gossip. But can you find someone trusted where you can simply say, "Hey, here's the truth. Here's how it made me feel. Here's what just happened that triggered me. Here's how it made me feel," right? So, and I told you guys before we hit record, I had an interview. I don't know if it'll air before this one or after this one. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. But I had an interview with a pastor who, just started spitting out narcissistic responses. I called him on it, and he doubled down and tried to take over the conversation. And he hit some of those triggers that literally triggered the PTSD I have from as a child and the PTSD from spiritual abuse. So the few triggers that overlap, like when you hit those, I still struggle. I feel pretty healed in most places. That one, to be totally candid, I yelled. I yelled. I didn't handle myself super well in that moment. Still plan on playing the podcast and explaining it because, one, we're going to be honest of, hey, I got triggered. Here's what happened. Two, there's a reason I got triggered. Right. And this kind of responses happen in a lot of churches. So don't feel bad if you're getting triggered. Don't feel bad if you're going to that place where you feel flooded and hijacked and all of a sudden, you're feeling those emotions again. You're angry, frustrated, bitter, depressed, all of those things, just deep sadness. But talking about it, what happened, why you feel that way, it will help. It feels 100%. Painful in the moment, but it helps a ton. Spiritual abuse is terrible because it causes trauma that can linger for a lifetime. And the pain that comes with spiritual abuse, that's the kind of pain that a person can feel deep into their soul. At the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we want to stop spiritual abuse through awareness, education, research, and practical resources. You see, at SAI, we're fighting for a future where spiritual abuse is rare and really hard to hide. But we can't do this without your help. As a donor-funded nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our community for everything that we do. So, if you've been blessed or encouraged by this podcast in any way, would you consider giving a donation of any kind? Because by partnering with SAI financially, you are giving a voice to the voiceless. You're going to help more people heal from the devastating effects of spiritual abuse, and you're going to help us to challenge more churches to create safe and healthy environments for everyone. You can give a donation by clicking on the link in the description below or by visiting spiritualabuse.institute. Every gift counts, and we are hyper grateful for every donor and every supporter of this community. And hey, in May and June, we're looking specifically for 100 people who would commit to giving $1 a day to support SAI. By giving as little as $1 a day, you'll help us reach our budget for the rest of the year, and you're going to help us to get more content out, to help more people heal, and to do work with more churches who want to start doing things the right way. So if you've been impacted in any way by this content or the Church Disrupted podcast, would you consider joining the 100 for 1 campaign and becoming a financial supporter of SAI? Thank you so much for your consideration. And guys, thank you. Thank you to every single person who has already partnered with us financially. Together, we can end spiritual abuse and we can help the church become a place of hope and healing for everyone again. Leann, what about you? What has helped you get to this point where it's so much less triggering now?
Yeah, I think for me, it's been even just reminding myself in those moments, like, hey, you're safe. You're not in that situation again. This is different. These are different people, different things. And reminding myself that not every place I go and not everything I do has those kind of people there. We go to a fantastic church that we absolutely love. From time to time, there are things here and there where we're like, oh, we've heard that before. That's, me and Sean will both be like, oh, that didn't feel good. But
it's a physical response.
It is.
Like, you're not just saying that. Like, it's a physical response.
You twitch, but it's also a reminder of, hey, reminding myself truths. Like, we chose this church for a reason. It has been a safety point for us. We have had vulnerable conversations just authentically, and it just kind of happened organically with leadership of this church, that we got to know them. We got to heal in that way, and being like, okay, we feel safe. We feel seen, we feel heard.
Yeah.
And knowing, like, hey, this is not the same thing happening over again. Like you said, churches love catchphrases. A lot of churches love the same catchphrases. So it's bound to happen.
Because the catchphrase comes from the same creator of the same system they're always running, which is a different topic. Y'all's church is amazing. My only beef with them is that they use, my biggest concern is that they use some of those same systems. But the cool thing is, I don't even go to your church, and I've had vulnerable, deep conversations with your leaders about those things, because they keep going against the grain of a lot of these systems.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's helpful too. Like, you said that if we don't heal from what we went through, if we don't process it, we'll take our hurt and project it on the next place that we go, and the people we're around, even non-church people, even outside of church environments. And that's unfair to them, because then we almost become abusive in our own way, because we're projecting the abuse we went through, we project it on other people.
Yeah.
So it's going to happen. Give yourself grace when it happens. But let me encourage you, do the work of healing. And if you're not sure where to start, join the community, DM me and ask. Whether we get you in a table group or we just point you in certain directions, do the work of healing, because otherwise you're going to take that hurt everywhere you go. And it's going to repeat because you expect it to repeat.
Yes.
Right? There's a difference in recognizing red flags, setting up hard boundaries, because we've learned from spiritual abuse. There's a difference in that and expecting spiritual abuse. So I'm going to butcher the way that she said this, but if you haven't listened to the episode with Natalie Runyon, she said there's a difference between, I think it was discernment, and maybe she said deception. She did a great job. It was alliterated, but it was basically, are we expecting something bad to happen, or are we discerning that something bad happened, right?
Right.
And we can expect something bad to happen. We can expect the other shoe to drop. And if we do, we're going to see ghosts. We're going to see shadows. So it's important that we are very mindful of red flags. It's important we have other people in our circles that we can talk to about it and say, hey, this feels like a red flag. Is it a red flag to you, or am I overreacting? And I've had to ask you guys that question before. And there's times where we've all had to tell each other,
yep,
you're overreacting a little bit. We don't think it was that bad, right? I've had other podcast hosts who, we all do this with each other. I had a host who's not on here today who reached out, about a month and a half ago, and just said, hey, I was in this sermon and I think they were preaching about you in Church Disrupted, right? And sent me a clip, and I was like, oh, they probably were, but I don't take it as bad as you did, and right. Here is why, right? It's more of a yellow flag than a red flag. If it doesn't repeat, don't worry about it, right? We talk to each other about those things. So if you don't have someone safe to talk to, that's where, again, it stays there. Have someone that you can ask, but it's important that we heal, and we don't take that same hurt and project it somewhere that it's not, okay? So it's a fine line. How do we recognize red flags without projecting that hurt? And a lot of that is it is dangerous for your only community to be the community in your church.
Yes.
Okay? We need church community and Christian community who don't worship in the same gathering that we're a part of.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I'm not saying that was wrong in the first century, but in the church model today, that's dangerous, because you only have people who are in the same environment. You can't really talk to them and ask questions like that without it being gossip. So who do you have who's a Christ follower you trust who doesn't worship at the same ecclesia, the same gathering that you do. We all worship in different places.
We do.
Right? Not just us. Most of our hosts worship at different places, and I'm glad.
Yeah.
We don't want too many people from the same churches because we can all help each other in different ways and bring in different experiences. But
Absolutely.
that's super helpful. Leann, anything else that you've done that has really just been helpful to healing and getting free of those triggers?
I think having those safe people, like you said, to talk to, you have to be careful who you choose to
Very
be
careful.
in your circle and who you allow yourself to be vulnerable with, because it's really easy for it to turn on you, or for you to get influenced in the wrong way.
Yeah.
You'll have some people that might be in your circle that need to get out because they're encouraging those feelings of anger and, being vengeful, all of that. And that's not what you want. You want life-giving people. So,
Because it's okay to be angry.
yes.
It's okay to have a heart for righteous justice.
Yeah.
But we don't want to feed those emotions more than they need to be fed, because then they can take over. And a good emotion that is justified can turn into a bad emotion that's not justified in a hurry if we feed it.
And then you
Right.
become those people
Yeah.
that you got away from, like you said earlier. But also, it's those safe people also give you room to, like we've all experienced, to say some things that sometimes you're like, I wouldn't say to anybody else.
Yep.
But you need to get it out, and you need to say, I just needed to get this out. I know it sounds awful,
Yeah.
but I need to get it out in a safe place where I have people who aren't going to judge me and be like, okay, I get it. You said it. How do we process through that, not to think that way, right? And, I'm very fortunate to also have those people who aren't just yes people. Like, none of y'all, are yes people and just like, oh, you're so right all the time.
You're really close friends with my wife, and she
Yes.
won't tell. It doesn't matter how much she loves you. She's not going to tell you yes if it doesn't need to be a yes.
Right.
She's
100%.
challenging.
100%. And I love that, because those are the people that are going to grow you, that are going to help you stay on that healing journey and not let you go backwards, and they're going to keep you accountable. And so you need that. You need people who aren't just going to say you're right all the time, and all of that. You need people who are also going to call you out and say, hey, okay, how are we moving past this? Or, hey, that's not, we shouldn't say that or think that.
Yeah.
How do we move forward? Or sometimes people who say, hey, I've seen this red flag or something that you're heading towards. Have you seen it? Can we talk about it? Can we, process through that? Having safe people is so important to have around you and be able to speak freely with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that, Jeff, you just hit on a second ago that I think is really important for us to talk about, especially as we're talking about ways to find out if this is the right time for you to be moving or transitioning from your role to a different place, is making sure we have people outside of the community we worship in. My mother lived with me for a long time, and she's no longer in this area. So when she moved to her new city, she found a local body that she really likes. I went to visit, and I immediately felt some of those triggers that we're talking about. And I immediately said, this is just like this other place. Can't do it. However, as I sat and I was able to attend a few services and watch worship and do all the things, I realized it may be someplace that is similar, but it's not the same as some of those experiences I've had in other churches. And it was just really transformative for me to see that just because it's similar to where I've been does not make it the same as where I was.
Yeah, for sure. Got the dog jingling in the background. If anybody's hearing that, that's our podcast puppy and his rabies tag. Every once in a while he'll just bark and chime in or something. Anyway, we're trying to train him how to be a podcast puppy like Titan. Podcast dog for a really, really long time. But yeah, and there are probably going to be some people who are thinking before you just said that, you guys got off topic. You're talking about healing. You're talking about overcoming triggers. What does that have to do with when it's time to leave? Well, it has a lot to do with it, because a lot of our audience who ask that question, it's because they've already experienced church hurt or spiritual abuse in the past, even if it was when you were a kid, okay?
Yeah.
So it makes you ask those questions quicker, because once you've seen spiritual abuse, you can't unsee it,
Yep.
Okay. Once you've seen narcissism in leadership, you can't unsee it. Now, we've got to also make sure that we're not seeing it in places it doesn't exist. Okay. But the reason why this is important is because we are quicker to ask that question.
Right.
Okay. So it may not be as important if you're asking that question the first time, but every bit of this will be important on the other side of that question, because whether you stay at that church or whether you go, it is going to be vitally important that you heal, that you walk through the process. Otherwise, you may say, I don't know what you're talking about with all these triggers. I don't have any triggers. I just had a hurtful experience. You will have triggers. They will affect you, and you will eventually see that. So again, that's why it was so important that we talked about that.
Yes.
But let's talk about the meat and potatoes of this conversation. How do we know it's time to leave? Okay. And again, you started out, Corey, with by the time, and we'll start on this note because you mentioned this at the beginning. By the time you ask that question, it has already told you you're in one of three places again. Either I already should have left.
Yes.
Okay. I need to leave now or in the near future, or something has to change if I'm going to stay.
Right.
Okay. I just triggered the party balloons again. I still can't turn them off, but it's fun. It's fun. One of those three things is going to happen every single time, though. So the fact that you're asking that question, it just means, okay, I'm at a crossroads. I'm at a decision point. Okay. But when you get to that decision point, how in the world do we know which of those three things it is? I should have already left.
Right.
Because if you come to the conclusion, I should have already left, that means you don't pass go. You don't go to another service. The only thing that you may do is either write a letter or set up a meeting with some people in leadership in an honoring way to say, this is why I'm leaving. I would hope that you'd address this. Okay. If you realize it's past time to go, though, staying is only going to hurt.
Yeah.
Okay. If you realize I've got to, I need to go soon, it's time for me to go, that might be a month. It might be 6 months. It's probably a 6-month window, though, of are you serving? Do you need to close those things out? How do you handle and navigate relationships in a way that hopefully you don't lose any more of that community than you have to? Because we talked about how easy that is. How can you leave in the best way possible so that, again, you don't get branded as a villain and all those things?
Right.
How can you leave in the best way possible to where it doesn't hurt you, but you also make a difference and you let them know the truth? You're honest and honoring about what's going on. Okay. And then if it's one of those where you say it's not time to leave yet, but something has to change, well, then that's a different response as well, because we got to put a timeline on when is something going to change by and what has to change. You have to identify what has to change. The second thing you have to identify, what timeline does it have to at least have started changing by? Because if you say something has to change, the leadership agreed it's going to change, and 2 years later it hasn't changed, well, you're walking through the same hurt. People are still being damaged, right? So depending on which of those three things is actually going on depends on how you respond. So how do we determine when we ask that question, is it time to go? Okay? Because the question isn't, should I stay or should I go? It's, is it time to go now? Or do I have time to see if something changes before I leave, right? So if you're asking that question, though, is it time to go? The first thing we have to decide is which one of those three things is it? How do you make that decision? Because we've all been there, and that is really blurry and really hard to see, especially in the moment. And the more you love a church, the harder it is to see.
Well, I'll go first. I have yet to do that successfully, where it is a life-giving transition.
You've gotten much better at it.
I've gotten much better.
So we're talking about perfection. You've gotten much better.
Yeah, I'm making progress in that, but hopefully I don't have to make any more progress because I'm really trying to make sure that I'm finding those things a lot quicker.
Yeah, and the way you said that, it sounds like you've left like 50 churches.
You have trying to
not.
back
You've left like 2 churches.
Yeah. However, at one, it was a lot of things, like you said, that I noticed, I made comments about, I brought it to leadership's attention. I had life-giving relationships with those leaders, well, what I assume to be life-giving, where I could speak freely with those persons and share the experiences and the thoughts and the observations that I made. And my understanding was that, yeah, we were going to actually absolutely work on that. Yes, I see that we can do those things. And first time, which was really the second time.
It was a couple of times at the same church because you stayed so long,
yes,
Corey.
For sure.
Which is, guys, if you're in that situation, we're busting each other's chops here. But if you're in that situation, it makes sense. We're talking about this because we want to help you leave before it damages you more than it needs to, and also leave before you damage the church, yourself, anyone else, right? And that's why it's important to ask these questions, to know which one it is, and to choose the right behavior, because otherwise, a church can punt the promise of change down the road and keep you there to a point to where it gets really out of hand. So anyway, you should give yourself some grace.
I'm gonna work on giving myself some grace.
That's a reminder for you guys too. Give yourself some grace. Spiritual abuse isn't easy. You're not expected to be perfect, but we do have an expectation to learn and to heal and to grow.
So I'm going to give a super specific example. I had one of those benchmark birthdays. It was a very monumentous year, and a bunch of persons from the church decided to take this as an opportunity to celebrate me. And I had such a visceral, raw, angry response to that birthday. I realized that it was super triggering because it was somewhere that I no longer should be. And that's really when I started processing that there was a lot of adjustments and changes that need to occur. And, I had a friend recently remind me of that day, and that's kind of when I started making that connection. But the response that I gave was definitely not the response I would have wanted to give. But I do remember after that, I started having conversations because, I had enough relationships with enough persons who have influence in that ministry that I was hoping that there would be some change that could occur, and that we could acknowledge those things that I was experiencing and seeing, and just find ways to start correcting those behaviors. And what ended up happening was it was pacified. Oh yeah, Corey, you're so correct. I do. I see that. We understand that's what's going on. Hey, we're working on a plan to make it better.
You say the right words, but you don't take any action.
Correct. Meanwhile, after that very raw and disgraceful response that I gave to those persons who cared about me, celebrating me in a time because of all the things, it's something that I'm still finding and hearing about many years after that birthday. So it's super important to make sure that you're noticing those things. And when I would leave, I would always feel so exhausted. Well,
you'd been triggered so much that those triggers were no longer triggers, they were hair triggers.
Yeah.
It took the smallest thing and it would elicit the biggest emotion. So
Correct.
When a trigger's new, it takes a big push of that trigger to get a small rise in emotion.
Yeah.
Okay. When you've had a trigger for a while and you made it a pet instead of processing it and healing it, because let's be real, a lot of us, we make our triggers pets.
Yeah.
And we don't even do it on purpose. We just don't know what to do with it. If you let a trigger hang around for a while, you don't understand it, you don't process it, you don't take healing action. Well, the longer that trigger stays, the less pressure has to be put on that trigger to get a higher emotional response. So by the time you got to that birthday, it was a very low push on the trigger. The push on the trigger, I'm going to guess, was simply, because I don't think I was a part of this.
You weren't.
I think the push of the trigger was, we're not responding to the concerns that you've had while celebrating you. People from the same place. That was it. Very small. You belong to the same place that is not paying attention to these concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's causing me this hurt. It took literally, you just touch it, you graze it, and it was a tip-top emotional response. Okay? When that trigger first happened years before, they had to press it real hard and you got just a little irritated. Mm-hmm. That changes so fast and we don't realize that. So often we don't realize something is a trigger until we have that tip-top emotional response. And then we say, oh, I can't do that again. And guys, we're trying to be honest with you when we talk about these triggers and stuff. Corey has said, hey, I blew it in that space.
Right.
I told you guys about podcast interview with the pastor where, look, there were reasons why I responded that way, but still at the end of the day, I blew it. And right now the dog is upset at somebody who blew it outside apparently. But we made mistakes. We got triggers that triggered us even after all this healing work. And all that did though, that day shouldn't be something that makes you feel a bunch of shame years later. just like that podcast conversation, it doesn't make me feel any shame. Okay. I had conviction. I yelled too much. I shouldn't have done that. Right. I got too angry. But what it was an education. Both situations, yours years ago, mine just recently, it was an education that, this is still a bigger trigger than I realized. I thought I had limited all those triggers. This one, apparently I haven't. So I've got work to do on this specific trigger. Okay. And that's work that, whether I'm doing on my own or whether I'm having to go through with a therapist, I've got to do that work. You had to do that work. We try to be honest, though, so that you realize there's no shame in recognizing the trigger.
Right.
There should only be shame when we allow that trigger to grow and don't do anything about it, because then we know it's going to put us in a bad situation down the road. Right. So for you, Corey, you think, when you're deciding which one of those it is, it took you a while to figure out which one it was, and you probably moved through phases without realizing it. Looking back on it now, with what you've learned, what you've seen in other churches, what you've learned from our work with SAI, what advice would you give a person as far as just, hey, what are some things to look for to know which one of those three places am I in?
How do you feel arriving? One of the things that I remember very vividly is that in the beginning, arrival on a Sunday morning was before the sun was up, and I loved every minute of it. However, as I became more and more triggered, arrival was 5 minutes before service, and it was a very burdened. And I would literally, there were some mornings where the two of you, I'd walk in, it would be, and y'all would go, Corey, you're at church, turn it on. And it would be a complete 180. And I would do that until.
Which we did a disservice to you.
Right.
Because that was the way that we had been taught as well.
Correct.
We should never have to turn it on at church. If you walk into church and you're not in a great place, it's okay to be in that place. Let's talk about why. Let's walk through it together. We're a family. We're a part of the same body, right?
Yeah.
So I do want to say that I did a service to you by making you ever think you needed to turn it on. We need less volunteers and staff members in the church who turn it on when it's church time, and more who will be real and authentic and simply be who they are.
Yeah. Well, and again, nothing towards you, because you were definitely not the only person, because towards the further and further I got, it took more and more of those turn it on conversations for it to even, last.
I had to own my part in it, though.
Well, absolutely. And I appreciate that. And I did it to other people. There were people who I would lead, and I would do the exact same thing. Hey, if I can do it, you can do it too. Come on, let's go. It's time to do X, Y, and Z. And that's, like you said, that's a very big disservice. But it's something that, looking back, I've realized that being there was no longer life-giving when I had to turn it on. So that would be the big one for me, I think, is how you feel in that place.
That's a good one. And that doesn't mean that you're like 100%, 10 out of 10 excited every time you walk in.
Right.
But you should have some excitement and some hope and not dread. Okay?
Yeah.
So the more, when you start moving into dread, right, that's not a healthy place as a church environment. Something's wrong. Okay? So when a person starts feeling that, Corey, just to push on that, when a person starts noticing they're feeling more dread, what space does that tell them they're in out of the three places they could be?
Is it time to leave? I think that would be my first realization that I was asking. I should have been asking those questions.
Okay, so that was your realization. You should have been asking that question.
Looking back, that should have been my realization, because I didn't realize it in that point.
So if a person asks that question, then, so that triggers, I need to ask that question. Now that I've asked that question, how do I know it which question does that beg you to ask, or which place does that put you at? Should I have already left? Or I should have already left, I need to leave soon, or I have to leave if a change isn't made?
I think that would be more, I have to leave if a change isn't made. There was definitely an opportunity where I could have moved that further and done that quicker. But I think that by the time I was asking those questions, or behaving that way, because I was never asking those questions, but by the time that those were the behaviors that I was exhibiting, I should have been asking why and should I still be here? That doesn't mean that answer would have been yes. It may be yes it should have been yes for me, but if someone else is in that same position, it may not be yes. It may be soon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it sounds like it was one of two places that let you know where you're at. You were somewhere between something has to change or I'm on my way out.
Right.
Right. And I just need to do this well. Okay. Which that's helpful. And again, you didn't know to ask those questions. You didn't have that language. That's why we're doing this, guys. Conversations like this help to give people language. It's one of the things that I hear most often. Thank you so much for helping us give language to describe this. But we don't want to just help you have language to describe what's happening.
Right.
We want to help give you language to heal. We want to help give you language to know when it's time to go versus when it's time to stay. Because at the end of the day, we all generally, when we hear these abuse stories, these church hurt stories, it's people who wanted to see their church do well.
Right.
Right. So by the time you asked that question, you hadn't stayed too long at that point.
Right.
Right. It was, I need to decide so here's what I would ask. If I need to decide, is it something where something has to change or I should go now? Right. So when you're asking that question, it becomes, all right, what would need to change for me to feel hopeful again coming here? What would need to change for me to feel safe again coming here? What would need to change for the abusive behaviors that maybe I've recognized to stop? That question can come in a lot of different forms, but if you're trying to decide, am I in a place where something has to give, right? Or am I already on my way out? You got to ask, what would need to change? And do I believe wholeheartedly that it still could change? And if it changed, do I believe it would solve the problem? If the answer to either one of those or both of those is no, you need to start setting up your exit plan.
Correct.
If the answer to one of those is yes, you need to talk to somebody outside and get their wisdom, okay? And if the answer to both of those is the good answer, right? I know what could change. I do believe it can change. Then stay and try to change it. Start having those conversations, okay? Right. But that question, what would need to change, right? That lets you know, how do I decide? Is it between the middle one, I'm on my way out, or, I can still try to make change? Just by asking that question, you get a lot of clarity, if that makes sense. Okay. So that's the language that I would use. And we haven't, this isn't stuff that we've put a lot of work into yet. Right. That's why we put work into polishing this stuff. This is an open conversation around. So I'm stumbling over my words a little bit. We'll have this on a resource at some point.
Right.
Because that's really the question that you need to ask. Hey, Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. What else? What are you guys thinking? How else do we know which place we're in and what to do next?
I think having those conversations is, a huge deal. We went through that with our last church. After what we had gone through before that, we had said, hey, when we feel like there's something that we need to speak up on, we're going to do that in a nice way. We're going to have conversations with people. And we ended up doing that and found out very quickly we were being pacified, right? Because there was one set of pastors that everybody went to essentially to cry to, right? And they were the ones you went to. You didn't go to the senior pastor. You didn't go to anybody else. You went to them, right?
They'll make you feel good.
They'll make you feel good. They make you feel like family. Not saying that they're bad people.
Right.
That's just what they were good at, right? And we saw
But they're
that.
not going to make change or take it any further
No.
up the totem pole.
They're
And that was
gonna-
someone who was in authority to make change. They just weren't going to.
Yes. And so they learned very quickly how to communicate to us like, hey, essentially what pastor says goes. Like, we don't question it. I'm sorry you feel that way. You can come talk to us anytime, but nothing's going to change.
Well, and how many times have we talked about, it's good to ask questions in churches, but you can learn more from the response to the question than like how they respond than even the answer.
Yeah.
Right. And that was that. You learned questions aren't welcome.
Yes.
Tough questions aren't welcome.
Yes. And so, in the end, those pastors ended up almost essentially being weaponized against us, to kind of pacify a situation that was really hard that we walked through, know? And so they used that person to kind of be like, well, it's okay. This person's here. You like this person. So even though this is a bad conversation, it's fine because he's here, right? And that was a point where we saw, okay, we've asked the questions. We know nothing's going to change. This is not going to work out. So having conversations and knowing what you want to talk about, knowing what you want to figure out in those conversations is super important. And even then, don't walk away and make a quick judgment. Walk away, process it. Say, okay, what did I say what I wanted to say? What did the person say to me? How did they communicate? Do I feel like they said anything that's going to make change?
Yeah.
That is hopeful of change? Or did they just pacify me? And did they say, well, I'm sorry, but, that's the way the cookie crumbles. And go home, process that, pray about it.
Yeah.
Have conversations. This is where, like you said, it's super vital to have friends and close people in your circle that go to other churches because they're not seeing it the way you are. And they might have a different vantage point and they can pray with you about it too and say, hey, like, let's figure this out. Let's talk about it and process. But conversations are huge. And I think a lot of times when you walk in there knowing what you want to talk about, knowing what change you want to see, pretty quickly, okay, this is either going to happen or it's not. And I have to decide if I'm okay if nothing changes. Yeah. Or do I really need to see this change to stay and feel safe and feel like I'm going to be fed and I'm going to do, if I serve, am I going to be productive in that?
Yeah.
You have to know.
Well, and for most of us, if we're asking those questions, we're not okay if something doesn't change, right?
Right.
And let's just think that the natural response is let's wait as long as possible to ask questions, and especially the more uncomfortable they could be, because as humans, we generally don't like conflict, okay? People who like conflict, they're the people who trigger me to death, right? They just want to lean into it. They're few and far between. They're damaging, okay? We don't like conflict. It's important that we ask those questions, though, because questions should not be conflict.
Right.
Questions shouldn't lead to conflict in the church. They should lead to conversation. So there's 4 markers I heard. I'm just going to call this back to you, right? And you tell me if I'm hearing it right or I'm hearing it wrong. I heard that when you're not sure, hey, which of these 3 places am I in? But I've asked this question, is it time for me to go? What you would ask them to do is, okay, have a conversation. Okay? Have a conversation. Something doesn't feel right. And essentially you're saying how I know it's time to ask that question is something just doesn't feel right. It doesn't have to be way out of hand. It just doesn't feel right in my gut. We call it our gut, but what is it really? It's the Holy Spirit inside of us. Yeah. Something doesn't feel right. It's either the spirit or my flesh, so let's test it. Okay? And if it's my flesh, well, then I just got to deal with it. But if it's the Holy Spirit, then I got to ask questions. So the way you respond to that is to have a conversation. And that conversation, we're looking for 3 things. One, is it civil? Okay? And by civil, I mean they listen, they hear you out, they listen to understand, they don't attack, they don't get defensive, they don't, do any of that. Okay? If they're attacking, getting defensive, acting like you're coming against them or you're way out of line, or they're trying to give answers before they've listened, that is not a civil conversation. So the first thing is that conversation civil. The second thing that it sounds like that you're asking, is this conversation helpful? Is there something coming out of it? Not just a yes, we'll do that. Is there a here's the problem we see that we can agree on, and here's our plan for next steps. Maybe not our plan for solving it, but our plan for starting to solve it, okay? Because if they just hear you, but there's nothing helpful that happens, then you're likely just getting pacified and placated, which is a form of manipulation. They just want you to go away. So the first thing, is it civil? Second thing, is it helpful? Kind of the third thing that I heard outside of civil and helpful, is it loving? Okay. It can be civil and not be loving. Okay.
Yeah.
Loving, a lot of love, how you can tell it's love is there empathy there. Okay. So again, we've had conversations with pastors on this podcast who vehemently disagree with us on a lot of issues, yet they show empathy to how we got there, why we feel that way, and why, and empathy to how much hurt our audiences experience and why they feel that way. They show empathy to why so many Christians are asking these questions and say, even if I don't agree with the answer you come to, the question's valid.
Right.
Okay. Then you have pastors who want to be defensive about everything. They want to do all that, but they're not really showing any empathy. They may even say, oh yeah, of course it's a problem, but they're not empathizing with what you're feeling, with how it could be hurtful, with, so like when we talk about growth track on social media, and there are pastors who get in our comments and basically just say, you're an idiot, you couldn't be more wrong, growth track's great. They didn't show a single ounce of empathy or love for the people in the comments going, yeah, I've been hurt and burned by this.
I've had pastors use their personality as an excuse not to be empathetic, like to my face.
Yeah.
Have said, well, I had so-and-so talk to you because that's not really what I do. And I'm like, that's not
If
an
you're not
excuse.
empathetic, you're not a pastor. You may be an apostle, you may be a teacher, you may be an evangelist, but to be a pastor, you've got to have some empathy. But we should all have empathy because that's part of loving our brothers, okay? So you want to know if they're loving in that conversation? Did they listen to understand, which is also crossed into civility, but did they show empathy toward it? Okay, and again, there's a difference in saying, oh yeah, that's a problem, and showing empathy toward, in a loving conversation, it's, I never dreamed that could hurt people that way.
Right.
That wasn't my intention, but God, we got to do something. Like, I'm so sorry, right? I will apologize to people on social media when they share their stories. I'll just say, I'm so sorry you went through that. It seems like second nature to me. Doesn't seem like anything big. And you would be shocked the amount of times that someone will message me and go, you're the first person who's ever apologized to me over these issues. Well, did you talk to your church about it? Yes. No one apologized. Not even for what they did. No one ever said, I'm sorry you're hurting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I did something that hurt you. Right? So is it loving? Is it civil? Is it helpful? Is it loving? I'm stopping counting with my fingers because I don't want to trigger all the reactions anymore. But after you ask if it's loving, I think there's one more. Okay. And that's what I was hearing. Do those sound like they're on track so far though?
Yeah.
Okay. So is it civil? Is it helpful? Is it loving? Okay. Those are kind of the big ones that we're asking. But I think the next thing that we've got to ask is, how did I feel? How did I feel? Right? And again, go back to flesh versus spirit.
Yeah.
If I felt bad about it, was it just because I didn't get the answer that I wanted? Right? But again, why we're asking this question is not to say is someone sinful or not. We're asking this question to say, is it time for me to go?
Right.
Okay. Did it make me feel hopeful and positive? Because if it doesn't, even if they didn't do anything sinful, even if they didn't do anything wrong, if I leave that conversation and I don't feel hopeful and positive, then that wasn't the issue. Does that make sense? And it is time. Then is it time to go, or should I have already went?
Yeah.
Right? Do you see how clear that makes it? And again,
Yes.
if we're not careful, people look at that and go, oh, you're villainizing them because you didn't feel right. No, we're not villainizing them at all. They don't have to be sinful for it to feel wrong. But if it still feels wrong, then okay, we just had this meeting, and even if they did everything the right way, my feelings haven't changed. There has been a hurt or a damage that is too great to get over at this point.
Right.
Okay? So you can have a good conversation that is civil, okay? It is helpful, it is loving, and you still don't feel hopeful, right?
Right.
Then again, even if that is your flesh, that's not a good place for you to be, because your flesh has been hurt and scarred that until you heal, that's not a place you need to be. And it's not a place you can heal. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It could be that you don't feel good because the Holy Spirit's going, they're not doing it. It's not right, okay? But I always find it life-giving. There's very few places where it doesn't matter whether it's my flesh or the Holy Spirit. It's the same answer, right? But if it was civil, it was loving, and it was helpful, and you still don't feel good about it, again, it just lets you know I'm not staying here to make change, because it's not healthy for me. It's not helpful for them. Is that... Does that make sense? Is that helpful language?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Cool. And that's why I wanted to have you guys on this. You've experienced this, but I don't think we've ever put language to it. And this is something I've been working on, like I said, just toying around with the idea of what kind of language do we put to this. So again, those are the questions that we need to ask to know where we're at. There are more, but those are, I think, the biggest ones today, right? Hey, what's going on? Is this something that could lead to a conversation? Okay, was the conversation civil, helpful, loving? How did I feel about it afterwards? It needs to hit all four for you to stay and try to make change. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. If any of those four are out, you're definitely between the first two. Okay.
Right.
And I would say if half or less, if you don't have at least three, you've probably stayed too long. Right? If you have at least three that are in place, then maybe it's okay. How do I need to leave in an honoring and honest way? Okay. Because again, those conversations tell us so much. It was the same thing, when we talked about Corey, the stuff that you're looking at. How do I feel when I walk in the door?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then what do I do next with that? Right. And you're starting to ask, well, what would need to change how I feel? Okay. Well, do I think that's realistic? Okay. And if it changed tomorrow, would it immediately change how I feel? Would it change how I feel in a couple of weeks? Am I not sure if it would change how I feel? Right. Because again, when we're asking the question, is it time to leave? We're not just asking about the spiritual abuse, which sometimes is clearer than others. We're also asking about, so maybe you haven't been through spiritual abuse, but you've been hurt. Okay. Your hurt can be so deep, even if there's not sin there, that it's not a good place for you to be.
Right.
Okay. And we have to acknowledge that. So I think those questions help us. Once we decide where we're at, so all of those questions, those processes help us decide where we're at in that process. I've stayed too long. I need to prepare to leave in the next 6 months, or I need to try to make a change. But something's got to give. Okay. Once we decide where we're at, let's talk about each one. What do we do to leave in a way that is healthy and protective for you? Because the first thing you got to do, especially in spiritual abuse cases, you have to protect yourself. If you're worried about protecting the church over yourself, okay, that's not going to help anything. That's how we got in these places to begin with.
Right.
Okay, so you always have to start with, how do I walk in healing and protection for myself? The second question, though, is, again, especially if we're not sure it's spiritual abuse, if it's not to the point of church discipline, if it's hurting other people, we need to push it pretty hard. If we're not sure about that yet, then, hey, maybe I need to leave. There's a level of honoring that we need to leave with. There's a level of wanting to protect the church. That changes in every situation, okay? But after we decide where we're at, what do we do next to leave in the safest and healthiest way for us possible, and the healthiest possible way for the church, where we're only pushing on things and dismantling things that need to be for the protection of people? So let's start with, I've stayed too long. Okay. You get to the point, you ask the follow-up questions. So you start with the question, is it time to leave? Should I leave? Should I stay? And you ask the follow-up questions, you get to, I stayed too long. What do you do to leave well?
I think you first, when we did it one time, it was more of a, hey, I had to realize the people that were hurting me and the things that I was upset about, right? This was a really big church. There was a bunch of people. 3/4 of them had nothing to do with what was going on in my situation, right? Directly. As a whole, yes, but directly, no. So I had to realize I can't take my feelings out on everybody. I can't take my anger, my desire for revenge, for everybody to know how I was feeling, out on everybody, right? So I actually made the decision that we were figuring out, hey, do we stay? Do we go? We just went through an immense amount of hurt. I was still serving at the time, and I just didn't feel right about stepping away yet. But over time, as I continued to process, as I continued to just really lean on people around me and in my quiet time and pray about it, I was like, okay. And God opened another door for us, to be able to have a safe place to land. And so I had made a commitment to serve one Easter weekend. And it was, we all know it's a huge weekend.
Yeah.
So I felt in my spirit that I needed to finish out and I needed to close out and that be my last weekend. I hadn't told anybody, really close to that ministry or any of that because I didn't want it getting around. And so I went and I served that weekend. And after the last service, I went to my leader and just said, hey, it's time for me to not just step away from worship, but to step away from this church, and God has opened other opportunities. And we just feel like it's time for a new season in our family, and up until then, I had tried to carry myself in a way that was honoring and respectful of the people I was serving with and for, and was even told like, hey, which was, it was hard, but they were like, hey, we never imagined you would act this way. Like, so, graceful and just so honoring to people. And that was all I wanted, was to show that my relationship with God was still intact, no matter what was happening.
I'm still bearing fruit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness,
and I wasn't going to take it out on everybody else, and so we were able to just kind of say, okay, like, we're done, but not, throwing things back at people and being like, I hate this place and all this stuff. We just said, it's time.
And that was something that had hurt you all that wasn't at that point what you were going through. It wasn't endangering anyone else directly. So you didn't need to go through church discipline. But it sounds like you were kind of in between. You were in between that we've stayed too long. Okay. And we need to make a slow path to leaving. So it probably wasn't 6 months, right?
Oh gosh.
Or it may have been. I don't remember.
No, it was about 4 or 5.
Okay, yeah. So you were a little bit more on the middle one, right? But and that's because you were still processing it. You didn't have this language, so you processed it. I would say y'all had probably stayed too long, but you didn't have the language to process it. The moment you realized, oh, I can't keep doing this, it was, okay, well, Easter's in 2 weeks. I said I would do Easter, so I'm not doing this after Easter. Here's the end point. And I'm not telling anybody until Easter's done, and then I'll simply have the conversation, here's why we're leaving. You can do that with what you will, and then leave peaceably. So I think there's 2 things that we can learn from that. One, when it's past time for me to leave, whether it's that week or in the next 2 to 3 weeks, it's a within the month. Okay? It's a within the month. Now, I would be very careful dragging it out toward a month unless you feel like God is calling you to do that. Okay? But within the month, and you set a firm immediate end date. Okay. And you decide who are we telling what, who needs to know what. We're not telling them until we're not coming back. This is right. And hey, if you change those things, great. We're gone. We feel released, right? If you tell them early, it gets super, again, if you want to tell them early and let them sit on it, tell them and leave then. You don't need to sit on it. Okay?
It never seems to go well when you give them a lot of leadway time.
It doesn't, right? So just have the conversation and then go. And if you need to have the conversation now, you need to leave now. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. I think the other thing, though, because again, y'all were kind of in between. If you say, I haven't stayed too long, but I need to leave, I need to start making arrangements. Again, we said 6 months max. One of the first things you need to do is you're praying through it and thinking about it. You need to very soon set a date.
Yes.
And say, by this date, no later, I will be gone. Because if not, again, we don't like conflict. It is easy. It's scary to step out. That means all kinds of new questions. Yeah. Like, well, who's my faith community going to be? How many of my friendships am I going to lose? All those sort of things, okay? So set a date up front. As soon as you knew, you set Easter, okay? Set a date. By this time, I'll be gone. So I remember, it wasn't that I should have already been gone. it was, I think I need to leave, but I'm waiting on God to give me some wisdom in some areas from him and some people. So I did it a little different at the time. I would probably do it different now and lean more toward the 6 months for most people. But I set a date of a year. And because I wasn't sure and I didn't have this language, I said, by this point next year, I will make a decision. Okay. Or I'll have the information to make a decision. Then I made a decision and set a date on, okay, well, within the next 4 months after that, I will be gone. And here's when I'll have this conversation. Right. So again, it's important if you're the middle one, where you say, I haven't stayed too long, but I do need to start making arrangements to go. You need to, okay, well, what do I need to do before I go to feel like I left well? For you, Leann, it was, I need to show the fruit of the Spirit, be honoring, be peaceful, even in the middle of people seeing this hurt. It was also, I need to finish my commitments in serving. And the most natural place to do that is through Easter. If I can get them through Easter, then I'm done everything I'm required to do. Okay. Again, everybody's going to be different there. What do I feel like I need to do in order to leave well, to feel good about myself? Okay. All right. Once I have those things down, when do I think I should have that done by? Set a date. And if I don't, I did my best. Right. And then you walk through those two things together. So does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think also a big piece that is hard too is realizing, especially if you're married or you're in a relationship, is having those conversations with your partner, and saying, hey, this is where I'm at. Because in that time frame, Sean was like, I'm out. I'm done. Burn this place to the ground. He's, that's
not
who he
really
is.
burn
Not
this place
really,
to the
no,
ground,
but
it's just this is an unhealthy place for me to be.
Yes, he was like, I'm done. Forget it. Forget everybody. Bye.
And that was the struggle. So the reason why I think you were in between is you were in a different spot. I think you were in the middle spot, which was, personally, I know we need to leave, but I feel like I need to leave this way. And Sean was, I've stayed too long, right? And as a couple, you got to answer these questions together, not individually. It's not an average, okay? And what I would say, and this is hard, right? Going back, and you didn't have language for this, you didn't know, but we can look back on it now. The spouse who is in the most pain and is in the most vulnerable position, that is actually the place you're at.
Right.
Right. So if one spouse says, I've stayed too long, we need to not go, let's go have one final conversation with them about why we're leaving and move on. Okay. And the other person is, I want to stay 4 or 6 months, finish well. Right. Then I think you've got to say, you know what, for the sake of the person that was hurt the most, we're going to do this. Because otherwise we're going to be divided, and if you do it differently, then, well, if he has that conversation, well, then they know you're leaving, and then a lot of retaliation stuff can happen. It's going to be different.
And I think that's what I would have done differently in that scenario, even though, I felt good about the way I handled myself. That's me.
Yeah.
I wish we would have come together better. But again, in that moment, we were still all in the same place together. So we were all kind of, emotions were crazy. So it's important to have those outside people, right? It's very important to have that conversation with your spouse, with, your partner, whatever that looks like, and say, okay, what do we need to do together? Because we are a family. It's not just me. It's not just you. It's both of us. What do we both need to do? What is there might be a compromise that you have to realize, it needs to happen instead. Because, like you said...
And I would fight away from the compromise, and here's the reason why. Unless it's a really minor compromise, there's always someone who's in a more vulnerable position, and the person who's in the more vulnerable position needs to be protected, right? So, like, when we made the decision to, leave the church that we had so much spiritual abuse done at, I was actually not in the most vulnerable position. My wife was.
Right.
So, I was fine to stay and push for some real uncomfortable change and make them declare public intentions about we're either going to deal with this sin or not, right? I had to immediately go to more church discipline than conversations, though, because my wife was in the more vulnerable state, and we always protect. This is something. This is a good learning for pastors. When it comes to anything in the church, we always protect the most vulnerable person first. Okay, it's not about the rights of anybody else. It's about the needs of the most vulnerable person. Paul said, hey, I'm fine to eat meat sacrificed to idols. I'm fine, to do these things. But if me eating that meat sacrificed to idols hurts your conscience, I'm not going to do it around you because you're the more vulnerable part of that population, right? Like I like, I'm fine drinking. I like to have a good bourbon. I like to have a good margarita. I like to do all that. Yeah, if I'm with a friend who says, no, I'm coming out of alcoholism, I can't do that, right? Then they're the more vulnerable person in the relationship. So I do what they need. Right? That's how the kingdom of God operates. That's how the church operates. So it has to happen in our marriages, but it's a good lesson for pastors because so many times we say, well, that's not everybody's experience.
Yeah.
Everybody doesn't feel that way. We did it with good intentions. Here's why we did it. No. What do we need to do for the person who's most vulnerable in this situation, who has been hurt by this? Because they are still loved by God. They're still a part of the body, right? And we don't ignore pain in our body. We don't ignore disease in our body. Okay, when we ignore it and minimize it, it is to me the same as saying, very much the same as saying, well, you know what? I know I was diagnosed with cancer, but I'm not showing any symptoms yet, and it's just in my pancreas. I'm not showing any symptoms. If I go take chemo, that's going to mess the rest of my body up. I'm not going to be able to play pickleball. I'm not going to be able to play golf. I'm not going to be able to hang out. I'm going to feel sick. I might lose my hair. Why would I do that? Well, you would do that because there's a vulnerable organ in your body that if you don't get it healthy, it'll kill the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right? I use that same example with the pastor, very similar example with the pastor that, I didn't respond super well with and that pushed all my buttons. And he hated that. He hated that example. Of course, though, he hated that example because it requires us to say we make space and room for people in the body, and we don't do something just because it leads to growth if it's hurting some people in the process. So, hey Disruptors, have you heard about the Church Disrupted community? It's an online community for Church Disrupted listeners where you can ask questions, you can connect and talk with other like-minded people who've experienced church hurt and spiritual abuse, and you can ask honest and vulnerable questions without judgment of any kind. And that's without the trolls, the anger, and the constant arguments that tend to come with social media. And the best part is it's 100% free because of our gracious and generous donors. So, if you've experienced church hurt, spiritual abuse, or religious trauma of any kind, and you're on the healing journey, I want to invite you to join me in the Church Disrupted community. You can join at disrupted.church or spiritualabuse.institute. And we're also including a link below where you can join just through the description. So, what are you waiting for? Join the Church Disrupted community for free today. We can't wait to meet you. Corey, do you see anything different with those first two? If you come to the place where you either, I've stayed too long, or you come to the place where you say, I need to go, but I need to leave well. I've got up to 6 months. Do you see anything that we missed on what actions a person should take?
I'll tell you what actions you should not take. You should not. For the community,
let me change the question. Get real vulnerable.
It was a very I did not do a great job in that transition. So I was way closer to Sean, and it was way more of a yes, take the pitchforks, let's go. And I very quickly departed. I had in my head made a decision of when that would be, but what I did not do is champion it well, and I was not very healthy in doing so. So as I've responded, going forward, I've tried to be very protective of the way that I speak about that time, because I understand that I did not do a great job of being protective up until that point.
So can I just speak into that for a minute? There's going to be times where you say, I think I'm in the middle spot because like Leann, I want to leave really well.
Yeah.
I've got a specific way I feel like God's calling me to leave. I want to do these things. I want to leave the people I'm serving well. I want to leave my community well. I want to make sure, and that's kind of who you are. I want to make sure no balls are dropped and the people are taken care of because, you serve in so many places.
Right.
Which it's so funny that people still are like, you guys just don't want to serve. And it's like, do you know any of us? We all serve a lot. But if you get to that point, and that's what you want to do, but you're not capable of doing it in an honoring and honest way, right? So it's what you wanted to do.
Yes.
But as you started doing it, you're like, I'm not doing this well.
Right.
Okay. If you're not capable of doing that well, then it doesn't matter what you want to do. You're just not capable of it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what you feel like God is calling you to do there. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter what God's calling you to do. I'm saying it doesn't matter what you feel like God is calling you to do. Because here's what I know. God is not going to call you to do something that you're incapable of doing.
Right.
Right? So I feel like I should do this. I feel like God's calling me to do this, but I'm just not capable, and I'm hurting people and myself. Okay, I don't care if that comes up a week after you started, a month after you started, or halfway through. The moment you realize I'm not doing this well, okay, now you realize, okay, I was wrong. I thought I needed to take time. I've stayed too long. And it may be that I just took too much time. I thought I could do 6 months when 3 months was my limit, and I hadn't stayed too long, but now I've stayed too long.
Yes.
But if your staying can't be done well, it's time to have the conversation about, especially when it comes to spiritual abuse and stuff, it's time to have the conversation and say, hey, these things are hurting people. These things hurt me. They cannot continue. If you need to do church discipline, you do it. But that's the moment you say, okay, well, then I got to have that conversation and leave. I can't just keep. Does that make sense? Because I think
Absolutely.
it would save you a lot of heartache.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I think those are things that I've learned since that point, is that once I realized I had gone too far or stayed too long, then I should have made a much quicker path out, as opposed to still trying to maintain that longevity and do it the right way in a long period. Because you're right, I wore a lot of hats. So as I started offloading the
And
hats
that was
I
its
wore,
own issue. You were
absolutely.
wearing way too many hats, but
Way too many
that's
hats.
another podcast conversation.
way too many hats. But what I started doing was, very strategically passing those hats off so that it was never even like questioned as to why. And there was just a point where I hit a mountaintop, and I was just like, hey, I'm done with this.
Yeah, past this point, I can't stay.
Yeah. So it was memorable, to say the least. And I would have done that a whole lot better if, instead of making it a 6-month process, I made it a 3-month process.
Yeah. And guys, that's why we have these conversations. That's why we're trying to be so honest with you. We want to help you do this better than we've done it at times.
Yeah.
We want to help you heal faster than we've done it at times. When you're going through spiritual abuse, there is no playbook. When you're going through deep church hurt, there is no playbook. That's why we're trying to do the work to say, hey, let's learn from all the experiences, not just ours, but all the experiences that we're hearing. Let's learn. Let's help build language around this, practice around this, right? Because otherwise we just do more damage in the process. And I'm not worried about the damage to the church by itself. I'm worried about the damage to ourselves as well. Now, I also think that the honesty of this conversation, it brings up a good example of what I was talking about earlier. When we talked about when you have a conversation, with your leaders and you're trying to gauge, how did it go? What are my next steps? It was, is it civil? Is it helpful? Is it loving? We talked about loving. There's empathy there. Okay. So I want you to think about this. We have all talked about a church that deeply hurt us. It was the last time we all went to church together, right? Deeply hurt us. And then over the years, we watched it hurt a lot more people. For those that are asking, no, this is not fresh. We would not be having these conversations around this table.
No.
Church Disrupted and SAI would not be a thing if we couldn't do this well. One of the things we had to be able to do, we have to be able to have these conversations with empathy.
Yeah.
We have to be healed enough to have empathy, okay? So we talked about earlier, you'll know if it's loving by if there's empathy there. But we can take a church that has caused us all severe trauma and has, for the most part, diminished, minimized, and ignored their part in that, right? Yet we're not angry.
Yeah.
There's a righteous indignation of I don't want people hurt anymore, and that's with all of this, right? But when I talk about this church, when you talk about this church, when you talk about this church, those are the conversations where we actually get the least
Upset.
indignation. If people are paying attention, all I see is empathy. Yeah. Empathy for, what, I didn't handle my part completely right in this. I didn't, I could have done this a little better. That empathy is saying, even if I don't think I was wrong in the conclusion I came to, I can still say, you know what, I got to own my part in what I did. That's what love in the body of Christ looks like. It involves that empathy. And if you are at a church where the church leaders, when presented with, this has hurt me, this is hurting people, if they're presented with that and they can't have that empathy, they can't ever come back to the side of saying, even if we don't fully agree, like, I empathize with you and I'm so sorry, right? If they can't come to that, then I would say the first moment that you notice that, it's time to leave.
Right.
It's just, do I leave now or do I leave in the next 6 months?
Yeah.
Okay. That is something we don't pay enough attention to. It's why those conversations are so helpful. But I thought this was a good example because, I just noticed as we were talking, the softness and the fondness that we still have for these people and these leaders in this church that hurt us so bad. Right. Also, that's a good indicator, guys, of I don't think we're ever fully healed on this side of heaven. Those triggers don't fully go away. We manage them. And then when we realize, I'm not managing that one well, like I talked about earlier, we got to do some things with it. But how do I know when I'm getting to a place of healing, when I'm operating in healing instead of hurt? I would say one of the biggest ways to know that is when I'm no longer angry and trying to get not just justice. I'm not angry and trying to take vengeance on the people who hurt me and hurt others. I am empathetic and heartbroken for them. Now, empathetic and heartbroken doesn't mean we hold them to justice for what they've done, okay? Especially if it's criminal, okay? Two things can be true at the same time.
Right.
But when you start empathizing and being heartbroken for the people who hurt you and how they got to that place, right? Doesn't mean that we give them grace that they don't do, that they don't need, that's going to hurt people or anything like that. But it does mean that healing work has begun to take place in your heart, right? So anyway, I think that's helpful as well. What about the place where you say, you know what, I think I can still make a change. I think I can still make a change. What actions do you take there? Because again, there has to be some boundaries around that. Otherwise, we'll try to make that change for 10, 15, 20 years. And we've heard people who on the back end said, I was just trying to make a change. That was the place I thought I needed to come to. And then all of a sudden I realized I damaged myself and my family for decades. So what do we do when we know we're in the third place? We're not called to leave yet, but something has to change.
Oh, it's hard.
Yeah.
That's the hardest one. And it feels a lot like the middle one. So we've talked about how to know the difference.
I think you have those conversations. You offer helpful suggestions of how to get there, especially if you're in the middle of that ministry, right? You say, hey, these are some ideas I might have. Maybe I try them? Can we try them as a whole? See how open they are, to suggestions and to help. Yeah, because that's another conversation that you'll learn a lot from, and if they give you room to do those things, to grow, to change things, go for it. Try them. See how they work. Sometimes that is it's another pacifier though, because they're like, well, this ministry's over here. We don't really care. They can do whatever they want. And we'll just, we'll call it a day. So I think seeing how open they are to suggestions and trying new things, and things like that is important. But I will say personally, I can't contribute much to that because it's never gone well. Or I've had the conversations of, hey, this is the way it is. There is no conversation.
And that lets you know where you stand.
And then you're like, oh, okay. And that was one of our first transitions for Sean and I, was we realized, hey, things aren't going to change. They're happy with the way things are. They don't want anything different. We know that we want more in our ministry that we do as husband and wife. Yeah. So it's time for us to go and find how to do that somewhere else.
And if that's not spiritual abuse, if spiritual abuse is not involved, we're just talking about church hurt, that's the healthiest way to leave. Okay, well, look, we wanted to make a change. We felt like we needed to stay until a change was made. But they made it very clear in that conversation they don't want to make a change. Okay, well, it's going to hurt us and hurt them for us not make the change. There's no sin involved. Let's just move on. Clean break. And now you went from, we don't need to leave yet. We need to still try to make a change to, okay, I've stayed too late. If I stay a moment past this conversation, I've stayed too late. Okay. And that makes it very clear. Now, if it's spiritual abuse, we still have to speak into those things. But that's when I think, okay, I've stayed too late. The only reason I'm staying is to run through the church discipline process. I've got to initiate the church discipline process, and either this is fixed,
Right.
okay, because they've refused to fix it. So either the church fixes it and deals with the sin, or I'm leaving.
Well, and that can hurt your healing process if you don't have those conversations, because that's something that I didn't do that I should have done.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't just hurt your healing process. It leads to more people being hurt the same way.
It does.
Right.
But for yourself, it just really takes longer to heal and to process, because you had a couple conversations, but once, the bad kept trickling in and, all of that, and the bad things kept happening and you didn't take it further, it's hard for you to process and say, man, I should have had this conversation, or I should have had that conversation, or why didn't I say it to more people that needed to hear it?
Yeah.
And then so you're stuck in that, well, what if I would have just said something?
Well, I think that was helpful for, me and Candace from different places anyway, but I think it was helpful for us. We took addressing the issues that were abusive and hurting people. We took it as far as we could take it.
Yeah.
Right. But then after that, most people who listen to this podcast still don't know what church I was at unless they're like trying to search it online, because that's not the main topic of most of our conversations. Now, today's a very personal conversation, so of course it's going to come up. And we all spent time, at the same church. But I think when you decide, talk about that action, when you decide, okay, it's not time to leave yet, but something has to give. Okay. There's a lot of similarities to the middle one. I need to be planning to leave.
Right.
Okay. The first similarity is, again, what has to give. Okay. And that's not the similarity. That's just different. What has to give. But the first similarity is I got to put a time frame on it. Okay. How much change needs to happen by when for this to legitimately be moving forward and not be just pacifying me? Okay. And it's, again, that's a little harder with church hurt than it is with spiritual abuse. Okay.
Yeah.
This needs to be fixed and stopped within 365 days. Okay. And if it's not, then I'm out, or 6 months or 3 months, depending on the severity of it. It may not be that long. It may be less than your time frame of, leaving we talked about in the middle one. Okay. But if we don't put a time frame on it, people can take baby steps that will never get you to a solution. It will never get you to a change. And when it comes to spiritual abuse, we can't play around with that.
Yeah.
There has to be a change. Okay. So, hey, what needs to be changed? Let's clearly define it. So again, when you go have those conversations for change, you know what you're talking about. It stays on topic. If they're always trying to get you off topic, that's a whole nother red flag.
Right.
Okay. Second, what's my time frame? Because if it hasn't changed by then, and you decide up front, if it hasn't changed by then, do I leave slowly? And then when do I leave after that? Or if it hasn't changed by then, is that the moment I've stayed too long? You don't have to go through all three phases. Okay. Then after you do that, you have the conversations. But I think the whole time you say, the moment the conversations consistently don't show the four things we're looking for in those conversations. Is it civil? Is it helpful? Is it loving? How do I feel about it? Okay. The moment that happens, I have now either need to plan to leave or have stayed too long. I've shifted. Okay. And the reason why I say consistently is, what does consistently mean? I would say, hey, if it happens 3 times, it's pretty consistent. Okay. I'm not saying it has to happen every meeting for 6 months, but the reason why I say consistently is everybody can have a bad day. You can have a lot of good meetings, and one meeting, all of a sudden you've only got 2 of those 3 things there. It wasn't quite civil. You didn't feel good about it.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody can have a bad day. Did it happen twice? It happened 3 times. Right. You got to decide what consistently looks like to you, but I would say give it more than 1 unless it's egregious. Okay. But again, if those conversations are going well and you're headed toward, okay, this can still possibly be changed by the date that I set and felt in my spirit, right? Then stay and work that through. And then at the end of that, make that decision. Or if at any point there's no way this could get done by that date, make that decision. I'll give you an example. There have been people who have stayed in the Southern Baptist Convention, okay, because they said, oh, they're making changes. Well, here we are, I think 3 years after the initial sexual abuse allegations came out, when we found out for sure they weren't just allegations. At least 2 years has passed since we knew, there were leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention covering this up. I think 3 committees later, it now just got put in the lap of another committee. Okay. So at this point, there are people who said, I'll stay because they're working through it. And then all of a sudden have said, okay, no, we're taking baby steps. They're never going to get anything done. Okay. Now I have to shift. Okay. So maybe that wasn't the original time frame. Maybe you said we're going to give them 5 years to work this out. But after 3 years, we're not any closer than we were when we first started. Right. So again, there's nuance to that. Every situation is different. But at any point, it's not going to happen. What needs to happen to protect people by the time frame you feel comfortable with, then again, that's when I'm moving from this phase to either a slow leave or I've stayed too long. And it doesn't have to go through all 3 phases. It could immediately go to I've stayed too long. So how does that feel? Would that have been helpful to have that language, those questions to process, those actions to process when you were going through asking that same question, is it time to leave?
Yeah, it would definitely would have been helpful. Because as we're sitting here talking, I'm just looking back and I'm thinking on things. I was like, yeah, that would have helped. That would have helped. So I really think that this conversation is going to be good for our listeners. And we really hope that our listeners are getting something from this. Because even sitting here having this convo, I'm still getting stuff out of it. So,
yeah. And no promises because, time is limited right now. And a lot of it depends on, when we air this, what the funding's like. Do we have the space for it? But I may try to put together some, kind of a review, like a blog post with this that tightens all this up. Cause we're having this conversation in real time,
right,
so that people can go to it as a resource and see those questions a little bit more easily. But guys, thank you for not only this conversation, thank you for being I've said it multiple times, this conversation, but I don't want it to go unnoticed. You've been incredibly vulnerable and incredibly honest. Okay. And, guys, I hope that this has helped you. If you're asking that question, or someone who's asking the question, I love my church, but I'm seeing things that I'm not okay with. Is it time to leave? We hope that this has not only helped you, this has not only given you language to use, questions to ask, tools to use, but I hope as much as anything, it's given you an encouragement and permission to give yourself grace, while also the encouragement to take healing into your own hands. Yeah. We heal, but we give ourselves grace. We've all blown it. We haven't done this perfectly. You won't do this perfectly. Okay, we get in these situations because there's other people in the church who aren't doing things perfectly, and church leaders. We don't have to go after perfection. Give yourself grace, but at all times, let's pursue healing. Let's do, as far as it depends on us, let's live at peace with everyone. As far as it depends on us, let's be the hands and feet of Jesus. But before we finish the conversation today and completely land the plane, is there anything else that you want to make sure you leave the audience with?
I think make sure you always have a community, a safe community around you to process and to talk through, and just know that those questions, they need to be answered. Those questions that you get in your head, you have them for a reason. So process through them, talk through them, and just know that, the Holy Spirit is giving you that discernment for a reason. Yeah.
Well, and those communities are so helpful because they're not an echo chamber. When you have a healthy one, about half the time they say, no, you're seeing this wrong.
Yeah. I think it's important to not devalue the question. If we're asking those questions, a lot of times there's a lot of guilt and shame with that. So I think it's super important for our listeners in this community to not devalue that question.
Yeah.
If I ask you a question, one of the worst things I can do is to say, I know it's a dumb question, because all I'm doing is devaluing my own question. But if I can give myself enough grace and encouragement that that's a valid question, that puts you in a position to answer that question better.
Yeah. Because there's a reason why you're asking that question.
Yes.
Again, you're at a church because you've loved it and enjoyed it. There's a reason that question has popped up.
Yeah.
Okay, it doesn't mean nothing. It's not just you having a bad day. Something has shifted. So again, and guys, we know everybody's experience is totally different. The number one thing in all of this that we haven't talked about, and I want to make sure that we end with this because this can't be missed. The number one thing is that you always feel safe. And at any point that you do not feel safe in a church, it is immediately, I've stayed too long, leave. Okay.
Yes.
If you don't feel safe going to leaders and telling them why you're leaving, don't do that. So all of this needs to be kind of wrapped up in the caveat: your safety is the most important thing, and never, ever, ever stay in a church or an environment of any kind where you don't feel safe. Because if you don't feel safe, it's an automatic: I've stayed too long, and I need someone else to help me share what they need to fix. I don't need to be willing to do that. So that's I'm not sure how it took me so long to get to that one, because I want to make sure that that's before we really have this conversation at all. That's the thing that you need to know. Okay. Make sure that you're safe at all times. But I hope this was helpful for you guys as it was for me. Guys, I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And we're grateful for you guys. We're grateful for your support. We can't do this without you. So for every person who comments on social media, who shares, who sends encouraging messages, people who are in the community helping us, really care for other people, and to every single person who has donated or will donate, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because conversations like this, there's going to be people who get to leave in healthier ways and experience less hurt than we experienced. So anyway, grateful for you guys. We're grateful for everybody who's listening. And until the next time, grace and peace. We'll see you on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast.